I just got done reading a year's worth of Batman comics. Although reading a small library worth of comics is no large feat by any means, I did pick up a couple things I'd like to share with you from my experience. Stick around, let's talk about it. I think you'd really be hard pressed to find any comic book fan who doesn't at least appreciate Batman. You've got a classic tragic origin story, but at really the heart of it, you have a man who has no superpowers, no super capabilities. He can't fly, he doesn't shoot anything from his eyes, yet he stands shoulder to shoulder with the superheroes of the DC universe. And that's pretty impressive in itself. At the end of the day, he's just a guy who became insanely focused on his goal and avenging his parents' death. And to be honest with you, it's a goal that he's never going to reach. And that's why Batman has gone on for so long. One detail about my personal reading habits that I've noticed throughout this process is that I tend to gravitate more towards Batman stories that are not just straight superhero stories. I tend to gravitate more towards those where they mix it with another genre. Hush, for example, great story, one of my favorites. It's not just a straight superhero story, it's a mix between a superhero story and a gritty crime noir kind of mystery. In my mind, what Jeff Loeb did for Hush is exactly what Frank Miller did for Daredevil decades before. Another favorite Batman run of mine is Scott Snyder's run, and I'm sure that's a lot of people's favorites. His was not just a straight superhero story, it was a superhero horror story. And if you take a look at Joker behind me, you know exactly what I mean. I even really, really like Tom King's recent run, and I know that not a lot of people appreciated that, but to me, that's a mix of a superhero story with a romance and another kind of mystery tied into it. Yeah, I was really disappointed that DC cut his run short, and I am buying the Batman Catwoman limited series. I'm collecting them, I should say, but I haven't read them yet. I'm just going to wait until they're all released so I could read it all in one shot. Now, don't get me wrong, the straightforward superhero stories, or the more straightforward superhero stories, I should say, are what drew me into comics, and I do appreciate those stories very, very much. Stories like Nightfall and Night's End are really what got me interested in Batman in the first place and what drew me into comics altogether. Now, I'll say this of James Tynion's work. Before COVID hit and Tynion's run was just starting, I had gotten the first couple issues, and although I was aware of Tynion's work, I did collect Batman Eternal and Batman and Robin Eternal, and I did like the stories, at least enough to collect 52 issues of each respective title. I couldn't tell you what either of those stories are really about, and I have a hard time kind of recalling those right now for you as I speak to you. It wasn't anything spectacular that kind of jumped out to me or memorable. And when the run started, wasn't a fan. I, in fact, thought about dropping the book after so many years. And I think that kind of contributed a little bit into me not touching it for so long. Really, the reason I was so behind in my Batman reading was because of the pandemic. When everything hit, my LCS was closed by the state of New Jersey. Nobody could operate unless you were an essential business. And then even when they did open, both Marvel and DC were not shipping for a couple weeks there at least. And when they began to resume activities, although I would certainly call and make my payments over the phone, I simply didn't pick up my comics. I didn't want to risk anything. Prior to COVID, whenever I took my books home, and I'm sure that we all have our own little idiosyncrasies when it comes to reading, mine was I would read usually my X-Men first, work my way through all the Marvel books, and then find some sort of a appropriate transition, or else what I felt would be appropriate transition, into the DC books, complete all those and go into the independents. And by the time I was done with my independents, it'd usually be time for me to pick up my next round of pulls. And I would work my way backwards through the independents to DC to Marvel. And I would doing that back and forth for several years without an issue. So with COVID, when I finally did pick up my books, I had a huge stack to go through. And I kept reading, okay, let's start with X-Men, go through. But I had so much built up, by the time I got to the end of it, it was time for me to pick up my pulls again, and I started the whole process over. So finally, around sort of X, I stopped and said, okay, well, I've got to change my approach to reading. And I had to pick kind of a natural point where I ended the stories and moved on to the next title. When I think about the Batman story, one of the aspects that stick out to me the most is his rogues gallery. he's got really one of the best, if not the best, group of villains in all of comics. Names like the Joker, Riddler, Bane, Catwoman, Poison Ivy, Mr. Freeze, Scarecrow. The list goes on and on and on. The only problem that you run into that, in my experience, is that I feel that when a new writer takes over, they feel compelled to jump in and use some of these same characters that we see over and over and over again. And look, in the last 3 or 4 runs that I've mentioned, those characters have jumped up multiple times. In the case of Hush, I think he really had almost his entire rogues gallery involved in there at some point or another. Tynion's approach to this, I'll give him some credit, is a little bit different. Now, before I continue, I should warn you that if you haven't read the Batman series, or the Tynion's run, I should say, and you're expecting to, or you're planning to, I'm going to give you a couple spoilers here. So Tynion, of course, just gives us a cavalcade of Batman's villains just to begin with right out the gate. And he ties them into the past of a new villain. Now, new villains, I think, are very tricky with Batman. Everybody wants to bring their own kind of spin in, and that's great. I can easily expect that, and sometimes you get a great result. Look, Scott Snyder introduced the slab I have in the back there, the Batman Who Laughed. A great villain who was getting a little oversaturated for a bit, but he's, I think, one that's here to stay. Same with Loeb, with Hush, although we really haven't seen Hush jump up that much. And Snyder, of course, brought in the Court of Owls, which I think is a brilliant idea, one of my favorite villains. That being said, sometimes villains just don't resonate. Look at Snyder again. I don't even remember the name of the villain, but he had that weird flower guy. Why were we supposed to be afraid of the weird flower guy? It's one of those low points, I think, in the Snyder story, if not the lowest point. For the purposes of our video, this is going to cover Batman issues 87 to 94, missing issue 93, I read that online, 94 through 100, plus Batman Joker Warzone, Batman Annual 5, and Batman 101 through 105, as well as Batman Black and White. In the case of Tynion, he starts his run really with a cavalcade of familiar Batman villains, but very cleverly ties them into a story from the past. He's created this character called the Designer, who basically sat down with all these criminals early on in the career and said, okay, what do you want to accomplish and what's stopping you? What do you want to accomplish and what's stopping you? I guess he's kind of like a supervillain Tony Little. Of course, when he gets to Joker, and because the Joker is the Joker, he gives him an answer he doesn't want, and it leads into a giant fight between the villains and the Designer and his men, resulting in seemingly the death of the Designer. Now, supposedly, years later, the Designer has popped up again, because comics. And of course, we later learn to find that the Designer is actually a reanimated corpse, which is strange, that the Joker is controlling, and he's kind of scrounged up who he can to launch this master plan. Now, there's a couple issues I run into with this. First, why now? Why couldn't the Joker have done this 10 years ago or 15 years ago? That kind of point is kind of lingering to me. Maybe he was waiting for Alfred to be dead. I guess that would make sense, if anything. The second part to me, I don't really like this idea of upgraded supervillains. It just doesn't appeal to me. In that same book, that same slab I have in the back behind me, that story revolved around the Riddler being upgraded. And again, just like in that book, and just like in this story, Batman easily foils the Riddler. It's like, even though he was upgraded, his riddles were nothing. Nothing at all. And to me, it was kind of disservicing, not only to the story, but also to the Riddler. Where's the drama? Where's the danger? You know, if Batman can solve it easily, then why bother? What I do appreciate in this first arc of Tynion's run, called the Joker War, he really leaves the story in a good place. Yes, Batman wins, and the Joker seemingly gets away, just like the song. But it leaves us in a place where Bruce Wayne is without his money, Batman is without his Batcave, and you really get a sense of, okay, well, this is a story that's truly in a different direction. He, at least in the point where I kind of stopped my reading, which was right before Future State, I felt like he was turning his attention now more towards some of these newer characters. Just a rundown of some of these newer characters. You've got Punchline, who's a character I've been critical of, let's say, in the past. And to be honest with you, although I do think that this turn that they take towards the end of the story with her, where she's just more of a victim of the Joker's influence, does sound interesting. Again, there's just nothing about the character that really sticks out to me. I mean, I don't know that this will be a character we truly see after Tynion's run is over, but you got to give me some more information. You got to give me more detail, more background. Hopefully, in the post-Future State Batman world, there is information for me to go on from her. There's more story for me to go on, I should say. Ghostmaker was just okay to me. I kind of like how Tynion went to the lengths of trying to tie him back into Batman's past. But again, I mean, he just kind of seemed like a guy with a cool costume. It looked like he was something out of like the Metal Gear video game series. And the ending was just a little too abrupt. I didn't buy it. It was just kind of like the end of Rocky 3. Like, oh, they're friends now. Okay. Don't get it. I will say this. I really, really enjoyed that character, Clown Hunter. I think that that's by far the most interesting of all the new villains that Tynion has brought in so far. And I'd like to see his story expanded. I can easily see him being a permanent member of the Bat family, maybe even another Robin. I don't know. There seems to be quite a few of them at the moment. I have to say, though, I didn't like how his kind of story ended in the main arc. I found that Tynion kind of miswrote, in my opinion, of course, Harley. I liked what he was doing with Harley Quinn at first, where he was kind of saying, yeah, you know, one day, she was saying, hey, look, one day me and Punchline will be friends, we'll be drinking margaritas and whatever, but towards this end where Harley's kind of giving this big moral decision to the Clown Hunter and saying, okay, look, you want to kill me, you can kill me. I just don't get it. And it doesn't ring true to Harley. It's almost like you can insert any other reformed villain type of character in there, or anybody who you would want to. And that, to be honest with you, I think is a weaker point in this story. While I think Tynion is off to a rough start, in my opinion, and look, if you disagree with me, that's perfectly fine. We can all have our own opinions. Just to tie it back to Suicide Squad, that most recent trailer, opinions are like Starro, and everybody has one. If you disagree with me, of course, leave a comment. Let's discuss it. But again, I am hopeful that his stories did rebound post-Future State. I do have the stories sitting, waiting for me to read, and I am curious to see that new redesign with Scarecrow. That definitely looks interesting. But in my book, he's got a lot of ground to cover in it. Although it's not tied into the main Batman series, I'll say this. The standout issue I picked up and read in this whole collection was the first issue of Batman Black and White. I do love anthology series in general. It's a great way of telling a story in just a couple pages. Of this first volume, I have to say I really enjoyed Emma Rios' story, G. Willow Wilson's story. I love her work in general. But I have to say, hands down, the best, and I mean this is probably one of the better short Batman stories I've read in a while, was J.H. Williams' story. And I highly recommend that you pick it up just to read that. Thank you again for watching this video. I hope that you appreciated it and that you like some of the information I discussed in here. Again, if you disagree with me, that's perfectly fine. Go ahead and leave a comment. Let's discuss it. I do ask that if you, of course, give me a thumbs up, and if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I do appreciate it. And, of course, share this content with all of your friends and family. Thank you again for watching. I hope that you have a great evening. Peace, love, and comics. Good night.